Hello, everybody. So, I am not only a reviewer of books, I also fancy myself a writer, and I recently published three short little novellas on using CreateSpace on Amazon and Amazon Kindle. And I hope you don't mind. I will certainly link to them below. And I thought one by one I would read parts of them and put them up here on my YouTube channel. It's been a long time since I read out loud, so I don't know how it'll go, but I'll give it my best try. This one that I thought I would start with, of the three, it's first in chronological order, so the three are related, and they're all based on my time in the military. Yeah, my time in Iraq. So this first one is called Television, and this one, two of the three had been published before. This one was published in a wonderful anthology of short fiction that's inspired by our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, called Fire and Forget, and I will link to that in the description as well. Okay, so here goes. Television, and I'm just going to read a part of it. All right, let's see here. The morning was dark gray, and Sugar couldn't tell if there were clouds or a mist that would burn away. Sugar tied his boots and walked to the motor pool where Sergeant Alphabet had his trucks running and his men ready to go. Tommy was there too, wearing a tired grin. Lieutenant Sugar dropped his kit in the passenger seat of Delta 6. "I'm going to get the Terp. Meet me at the gate. I'll be right there." "We gotta go, sir," Sergeant Alphabet said. "I'll be right there." Sergeant Alphabet directed the four Humvees to the gate, and Lieutenant Sugar went to wake Stuttering John. He opened the door of the interpreter's hooch. A battery-operated lantern cast shadows about the room. It hummed on the floor beside one of the interpreters who prayed on his rug. Stuttering John was asleep. Despite his gray hair and wrinkled face, Stuttering John looked like a young boy as he slept. Another interpreter prayed, and Lieutenant Sugar said nothing to him. He shook Stuttering John's shoulder, and the old Iraqi man woke. Lieutenant Sugar watched him sit up and put his feet on the floor. He wore long underwear and looked around like he didn't know where he was. "Are you awake?" He nodded. "I have a difficult mission. I want you to come with me. You, no one else. I need your help." Lieutenant Sugar spoke in short phrases in the tempo of an Arab's broken English. Oh, and here I should interject and say that Lieutenant Sugar has been asked to go make contact with the family of a boy who was shot during a firefight. This is something that we did in Iraq, at least in 03-04 while I was there. So Lieutenant Sugar spoke in short phrases in the tempo of an Arab's broken English. "Would you like some tea? There is no time. No breakfast? No time. I have MRE for you in the truck." Stuttering John found his glasses. "I need to pee," he said, and rubbed his face. "There is little time. We leave as soon as you're ready." Stuttering John nodded again, and he looked back and forth as though he'd lost something. "It's a difficult one. I don't like this mission." Stuttering John dressed, his face puffy and expressionless. "We have to find the family of a child and speak to them," Lieutenant Sugar said. "We shot the child yesterday, sent him by helicopter to the hospital. I'll talk, you just translate. I need you because you are the best." Stuttering John was the best. He translated and almost never entered into his own conversations with locals. He buttoned his shirt and put a cap on his head. He stood up straight and stomped one foot on the floor, and raising his chin said, "Sir, I am ready, sir." The other interpreter continued to pray by his lantern. The two gate guards spoke with Sergeant Alphabet. They probably heard about the IED. "This is bullshit," Lieutenant Sugar heard Sergeant Alphabet say as he approached. "First these fuckers try to kill us, and now we gotta drive down that same fucking road to kiss their ass." Outside the main gate, a row of laborers sat on the ground next to the wall, waiting for the escort who would watch them spend the day spreading piles of gravel over the field. The cooks worked busily over stoves beside the chow hall, and in the motor pool a mechanic leaned all his weight against a torque wrench. Lieutenant Sugar climbed into Delta 6 and called a radio check with Alphabet. A gate guard scribbled some marks in his ledger, then dragged a strand of concertina wire out of the way. Everyone charged their weapons, and their small convoy of Humvees rolled into the middle lane of the mostly deserted Route Lion. A few locals were already out in the market. The first merchants removed the thatched grass mats from the fronts of their stalls. White chickens fluttered in their cages, and a cool dampness hung in the air. Stuttering John pulled his cap lower and didn't look out the window. To change things up, they veered off Route Lion after passing through the market, then drove on dirt side roads snaking between farms. Sergeant Alphabet was in the lead vehicle, looking at his GPS. They came upon 2 mud huts partially concealed by a small grove of date palms. Mud houses with their thick, sturdy walls. The houses were all by themselves and surrounded by a field, which was good. Soldiers would be able to see far in every directions. The Humvees drove to 2 adjacent corners of the structures, and all the soldiers but the gunners dismounted. Tommy cut the engine of Delta 6 and got out with the shotgun. 2 Iraqis ran toward them from far out in the field, and Lieutenant Sugar asked Stuttering John to exit the vehicle. The figures dropped their shovels as they ran and lifted their legs to make progress in the soft, loose ground. Sergeant Alphabet stood beside Lieutenant Sugar. Their backs were to the little house, but Tommy covered them with the shotgun. The first of the 2 was a woman. She stopped several meters from them. Lieutenant Sugar could see she had tears in her eyes already. "Well, fuck me," Sergeant Alphabet said. Sugar was thinking that too. He removed his helmet so they could see his face and clipped it by the chin strap to his body armor. He removed his ballistic sunglasses and stuffed them into a cargo pocket. The woman clapped her hands together and shook them at Lieutenant Sugar. She was saying something. She canted her head and kept saying it loud in a wailing voice with her hands clasped together like she was begging. The second of them, a man, put his hands on her shoulders and turned her away from them. They exchanged words, and Lieutenant Sugar watched. He glanced at Stuttering John and saw by his expression that he understood everything they said. "Is this the piece of shit whose feelings we hurt?" Sergeant Alphabet said. The woman wore a shawl over her head, and layers of rags wrapped thickly around her legs and held with pieces of wire. The man was lightly dressed for the morning's cold. His skinny legs and bare feet were gray with the mud of the field. The man held his woman by the wrists and called to Stuttering John, who said something back to him and gestured with an open palm toward Lieutenant Sugar. Lieutenant Sugar was familiar with this gesture. It was time for him to say something. The field was bare and the earth soft and broken. It extended some distance to an irrigation canal where tall, thick grass rose from the mud. Route Lion could be seen beyond it. The farmers both looked at Lieutenant Sugar. He stepped toward the man. Stuttering John and Sergeant Alphabet came with him, and the 3 of them advancing in a rank. "Are these the parents?" Lieutenant Sugar asked Stuttering John. "Sir, I am sure of it," Stuttering John said, without having spoken to the farmer. Lieutenant Sugar offered his hand to the man, and they shook, and Lieutenant Sugar put his hand over his heart in accordance with Arab custom. The woman began shouting again from behind her husband, and he said something over his shoulder at her. "Tell him my name is Lieutenant Sugar," Stuttering John told him. "Sir, he want to know how is his son." The farmer had a thick mustache and a deeply furrowed face and 2 hard eyes. "Tell him that I was not here when it happened, but I know what happened, and today I drove here to meet him face to face and tell him how his son is. He says thank you and praise be to God and like this, and he wants to know about his son. Tell him that we sent his son to the hospital." The farmers still looked at Lieutenant Sugar. Behind them, a car drove down Route Lion past the big gash in the road. "Tell him that we sent him to the best American hospital, Stuttering John told him. By helicopter, added Lieutenant Sugar. He was glad for the helicopter. The woman had a lot to say. She said it out loud and without any holding back. Stuttering John hesitated, said something back to her, then she replied with the same ferocity. Sir, he said to Lieutenant Sugar, but the woman wasn't finished. She was waving her hands all over the place, and Lieutenant Sugar and Sergeant Alphabet watched her hands. Sergeant Alphabet asked Lieutenant Sugar if he wanted him to control her. No, not yet, Lieutenant Sugar replied. Tell him that I just want to speak with him. Stuttering John told them, and the woman quieted again. No, tell him that I want to speak with him alone. I don't want her here. There was a debate between the farmers, and the man took the woman to the house. She pleaded with him using the same gestures as she'd used with Lieutenant Sugar earlier. When the farmer returned, Lieutenant Sugar took out 2 cigarettes, the 2 cigarettes he'd bummed from Tommy, and offered one. He lit his own, then passed the lighter to the farmer, who cupped his hands to shield the flame from the breeze. Sergeant Alphabet kept an eye on the house where the woman was. Sir, he say you can speak with him honestly. He only wants to know what is the truth. How is his son? Is he alive? Is he dead? Tell him he was wounded seriously. Tell him that is why we called the helicopter. The man asked again if his son was alive. Tell him he was alive when he left the chicken factory. Sir, he want to know how is he hurt. I don't know, Lieutenant Sugar lied. Tell him he was shot, that's all I know. He was shot because soldiers think he set off the bomb. Tell him that I wanted to come here and talk, even though I think his son set off the bomb. The farmer, who'd been looking intently into Sugar's face with his 2 hard eyes, turned towards the fields when Stuttering John was finished. He smoked. Lieutenant Sugar pulled on his cigarette without inhaling the harsh smoke. I wonder if it's true, he thought, the little bastard. They looked across the field over the irrigation canal to Route Lion. It was black and straight where it showed between the reeds of the irrigation canal. Most of the field had dry stalks plowed into the gray earth. In spots they stood crooked in the ground. The 2 of them looked for a long time and smoked. The farmer turned back and said something, and Stuttering John replied in Arabic, and they went back and forth. Sir, he says it is good for you to come, and he says like this, that it is a very bad thing, but good for you to come, and if you will have tea. And I told him you are very busy, and he says if we can come inside. Tell him no tea. There were bundles of dried reeds beside the house. The trucks outside could see far in every direction. Lieutenant Sugar asked Sergeant Alphabet to do a commo check with the trucks through his hand radio. In their body armor they brushed both sides of the low, narrow doorway. A boy who looked like he'd been suddenly awake and stared at them with wide eyes and open mouth. He looked torn between fear and curiosity. Their eyes adjusted to the dim light, and more of the room became apparent. There was a crooked bench along one wall, 2 chests, and a pile of blankets on the floor that looked like they'd been slept in. The far wall did not quite reach its adjacent one, and the space between them served as a doorway to the next room, from which they heard a woman's sobbing. The farmer gestured lavishly toward the bench, and Stuttering John and Lieutenant Sugar sat down. Sergeant Alphabet remained standing by the entrance. The boy stared at all his equipment. He watched Sergeant Alphabet speak into the radio on his shoulder and do another commo check with the vehicles outside. The farmer removed a ball of cloth from the hole in the mud wall which served as a window. A little bit of cold morning light shone through. He placed a lantern on the floor, kneeled beside it, and pumped vigorously. It lit, and he stayed on his knees in front of Sugar. Sugar felt like coming here was a mistake. He didn't want hospitality from a poor farmer whose son they'd shot. The farmer looked from Sugar to Stuttering John and spoke. "Sir, he says again for you to have some tea. Tell him no thank you, we have a busy morning." The farmer said something again, and Stuttering John answered, shaking his head. The farmer paused a moment and said something. "Sir, he says, how can he go see his son?" The sobbing from the next room quieted. Lieutenant Sugar knew the names of the towns between here and the base to which the boy was sent, and he explained it through Stuttering John. "He knows now," said Stuttering John. "If I could suggest something, sir," Lieutenant Sugar nodded. "Maybe a note he can show the soldier at the gate, so they will let him go." The boy leaned over the heat of the lantern and looked from Lieutenant Sugar to Sergeant Alphabet with his mouth open. Sergeant Alphabet stood by the door. He rolled his shoulders beneath the weight of his body armor. Lieutenant Sugar pulled a notepad from his cargo pocket, and the farmer watched him scribble a note. He signed it with his name and rank and dated it, and tore it from his notepad. "This is bullshit. You should tell him that if his other kid ever tries to blow me up, I'll shoot him too. And if I have to shoot that little fucker, I'll make sure I kill him so that we don't have to go through all this bullshit." Lieutenant Sugar handed the scrap of paper to the farmer, who folded it carefully and held it lightly between two fingers. Stuttering John looked at Sergeant Alphabet, but didn't hold his gaze when Sergeant Alphabet looked back. No one said anything, and the farmer held the note. Lieutenant Sugar asked Sergeant Alphabet to leave. "Hoo-ah, sir, I'll be outside," he said. Lieutenant Sugar made a second note with his name on it, and told Stuttering John to tell the farmer that if he has problems, he should come to the chicken factory and show this note to the guards. Lieutenant Sugar said goodbye in Arabic and put his hand over his heart. Stuttering John touched Lieutenant Sugar's arm as they exited the farmer's home. "You're a good man," he said. But Lieutenant Sugar's mind was elsewhere. He went outside and saw Sergeant Alphabet walking from one gun truck to the other. He could tell by his stride and by the way he carried his weapon that he was preparing the guys for the trip back. "That's why they sent me," Lieutenant Sugar told himself. "Sometimes you're handed a piece of shit and the best you can do is put a ribbon on it and pretend it smells like roses." During the return trip, Tommy talked about those gray wrinkled sausages they served in the chow hall and how they sounded pretty good about now, and Lieutenant Sugar felt glad he'd brought him as a driver. He thought about his girlfriend. It'd be nice to sit down with her and hear her voice for a little while. She was very beautiful, and he wanted to look at her and spend a little time with her before the big mission. It'd been nice to go for a slow walk on the sandy trail beneath the pines as they'd had in North Carolina before he left. He decided that as soon as he got back inside the wire, he'd reread the last letter from her. At 1100 local time, Lieutenant Sugar received his mission from Captain Yona. He made a plan, and 2 hours later he gave his operations order to his squad leaders. He sat on his cot and referred frequently to a map and satellite photos that had been spread on the floor between them. He pointed to the chest of his first squad leader. "Task," he said, "provide security to the main effort. Purpose, facilitate their movement to building Zebra 1-1. Third squad," he pointed at Sergeant Alphabet's chest. "Task, clear building Zebra 1-1 through Zebra 1-4. Sergeant Alphabet wrote intently in his notebook. Lieutenant Sugar pointed at him again. "Purpose, kill, capture, and deny sanctuary to insurgent forces." Lieutenant Sugar completed his order and asked if there were any questions. There were none. His squad leaders gathered their M4s and boonie caps and pocketed their little notebooks and pencils. No more distractions, Sugar thought. Everybody's thinking about doing their jobs and about staying alive. A small part of him was excited at the possibility of finally making contact with the enemy and finally seeing what war was all about.